Welcome to Curious Careers. I'm David Huff, the MBA Corporate Relationship Manager, and it's my pleasure to welcome Martin Griffiths here today to talk about his career. He's had a fantastic career in banking, traditional banking, and also fintech. So I really want to deep dive into Martin's career and learn what we can as the CAS community from Martin. Thanks for joining us, Martin. How are you?
Pleasure. Great to be here, David. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Let's just deep dive straight into it. And I'll ask you, Martin, can you give us a little bit of a background into your career, very kind of top level, just so we kind of know a little bit about who you are, where you've worked and what you've done, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure. No problem. How do you distill 37 years into a couple of minutes? It's so up until June this year, I was head of Fintech Banking at Barclays Corporate. I'm now running a little consultancy business advising fintechs. But I started my banking career way back, even before you were born, David, in 1984.
Yeah.
As a graduate of Essex University with a degree in pure maths. I was doing the traditional milk round, trying to find roles, and ended up working for Lloyds Bank, having turned down the inland revenue for some bizarre reason, and an engineering company that's no longer a telecoms engineering company called Plessy, which disappeared many years ago. Also turned down a role with Midland Bank at the time. I spent about 15 years at Lloyds before doing something which was pretty unheard of at the time. I moved to another bank. Went to Bank of Scotland. They were essentially a challenger bank, you could say, back then.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. They had no real presence in England and were making a stride into the English market back in the late 90s, and ended up hiring a load of bankers from other banks, which at that time was totally unheard of. You joined a bank, you had your final salary pension, nobody changed jobs, and I thought, why not? Let's give it a go. I spent another 10, 12 years at Bank of Scotland before joining Barclays around 13, 14 years ago.
Excellent. I have to jump in and ask there, why did you move from Lloyds to Bank of Scotland? What was your thinking?
It was back then. You tended to find that your career path could get blocked very easily. There wasn't the flexibility about applying for job roles. You waited for the phone call from the kind of personnel department saying there's jobs. And bizarrely, I got blocked for a role that I wanted to go for because my boss wouldn't let me go, and ended up leaving anyway. So I looked around, and this was the start of other banks looking around, and the Bank of Scotland role was a shift away from what Lloyds was, which was very traditional structure, and they were trying to do something different. And I fancied working for a smaller organisation and seeing what it was like at the time.
Excellent.
It was very, very different.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into that because I want to deep dive into that traditional banking because it's a bit mysterious for a lot of people who haven't worked in the sector. So what was your motivation? You had a lot of offers after university. So what was your motivation for getting into traditional banking? And a kind of quick follow-up question after that, how has the industry evolved over those 37 years?
Well,
That's a big one.
How long have you got? It's a long time ago. So I think I'd always seen banking as a career that was respectable, offered a good, solid kind of training and safety, security, dependability. It clearly isn't what it is now in terms of the kind of variety. But back then, it was very competitive to get jobs back in the 80s. I was a child of the baby boom. There was a lot of people struggling to find jobs. So actually getting a job offer back then was quite a challenge. So there's a little bit of, I've got a job, so I'm going to go. And if it doesn't work out, I'll try something something different. It wasn't one of those, oh, I'm going to be a banker when I grow up. It was never that. I tried to join the RAF, but
Okay.
I was going to be a pilot. Bizarrely.
Big difference.
Yeah, very, very big difference. But so no, I kind of fell into it in some respect.
That happens a lot.
Yep.
Yeah. And what about when you're in traditional banking? Can you tell us a little bit about the roles you had and the jobs? Was there anyone that stood out that you said, "Oh, I really enjoyed that particular role or that function"?
Back in the early days, your kind of path was very much mapped out. So if you joined as a graduate, you were put on a graduate program, probably as you are today. But
still the case, yeah.
But it was very, very traditional in that you had to go through a set career program, which almost always started in branch banking.
Okay.
And you would do all of what you class the old traditional in-branch stuff. So working on the counter, dealing with standing orders before direct debits came in, dealing with kind of account inquiries, lending administration, buying and selling stocks and shares, which we literally did in the branch.
In the branch, okay.
Yeah. Dealing in foreign exchange, cash and both trade-based foreign exchange. So again, dealing with letters of credit and all of the kind of stuff that went on with that, lending, securities, so taking mortgage forms. I remember the training we used to go on. Every single role had a specific training course.
Okay.
And some of these were very lengthy. So the securities training courses, which is where you learn how to take a mortgage or take a debenture or all of the stuff that you needed to take security for lending, was 13 weeks.
Wow.
So you spent 13 weeks at a bank training centre to learn that. And every course was like that. So for the lending course was 5 or 6 weeks.
Yeah.
The kind of stock and share one was a 3 or 4 week course. So you spent a lot of time being very specifically trained on every aspect of the banking journey. I think, and that's something that doesn't happen these days because you tend to be recruited into specialist roles and you have specialist departments dealing with that kind of stuff in the background. So that's changed dramatically. I think the roles that kind of stood out back then where I started to really enjoy it was the kind of the customer facing, lending, small business. Nice. So I helped set up one of the first small business centres for Lloyds back in around 1989. So this at the time, everything was done in a branch. Yeah. Whether it was small business, large business, retail banking, it was all hubbed around the local branch. Okay. It was very inconsistent, and it was kind of apart from the very large global corporates who were dealt with at head office, you could have had your local window cleaner all the way up to a reasonably large international business if they were based on the patch, all dealt with by one guy, and he was expected to do all this. So it became specialised, and I helped set up one of the first kind of independent units that managed business accounts in a separate team. So that was way back in 1989. Now that started to get me interested. I then moved into kind of what they call mid-corporate banking. Yeah. So you're dealing with anything up to 150 million, 200 million turnover businesses. Okay. And again, that was a separate kind of business unit. Nice. And that's where I kind of really focused on the kind of relationship banking, corporate banking. You could be covering any kind of industries. Okay. So I was looking after my local football team. I had cycle manufacturers, all kinds of weird and wonderful businesses that kind of were in the local region. So that was pretty interesting, and I think that got me on the kind of corporate journey.
Nice. That's so broad to the way they used to train people. Then you kind of had to know a bit about everything. So wow. There is let's talk about culture, and there is this maybe
sorry, excuse me.
Oh, no worries at all. There is this kind of perception that the culture of traditional banking is a suit, maybe I'd fit in with my waistcoat, a briefcase. Tell us what the culture is like behind the scenes. What's it like to work for a Lloyds, a Bank of Scotland, a Barclays?
Cultures can vary significantly. Yeah. I think your image of the banker, the Captain Mannering the bowler hat.
Yeah.
I would say that did exist back in the 80s and 90s.
But it's the
And
past. Yeah.
yeah, there is still you're still expected to wear a suit.
Yeah.
Ties have largely disappeared, apart from if you're in a formal meeting.
Okay.
And in some cases, and I know in some of the industry teams at Barclays, even ties were out the window. So the media team, because it was expected, but it's more about reflecting your client base.
Yes.
So
Okay.
if I was going out to see a fintech client, I very, very rarely wore a tie.
Yeah.
And would often just wear a casual jacket rather than a kind of a suit. If I was going to see a regulator,
fully buttoned up.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
So there's been a lot of changes in that, and the cultures in banks vary tremendously depending on which part of the bank you work in.
Okay.
So the culture in the investment bank would be very different to what it would be in the corporate bank, to what it would be in the retail bank and private bank. Yeah. And even within teams, within a kind of a part of the bank, it could vary significantly because it tends to. Culture is about the people. It's about the tone set by the leadership in that part of the organisation. It has gone from more conservative to a lot more relaxed. And it's not that dissimilar, I would say, in some respects now to a lot of the larger fintechs.
Okay.
I think as they've grown and become more, I don't know, not traditional, but larger organisations, their cultures kind of come more to the banks, and the banks are trying to adopt,
follow. Yeah, that's really interesting because I think the fintechs, and I'm happy to be correct here if I'm wrong, have tended to take more of a lead from those tech companies, those big, the Googles, the Microsofts, and how those kind of people act. And they're kind of more very towards that while still keeping a foot in the financial services area, culture-wise.
Yeah, I would say that. But I think as they've become larger and had significant sums invested in them, you will see the T-shirts and the kind of the jeans and the beards and all the kind of the traditional image of a fintech. Yeah. They are becoming, in some ways, more like investment banks.
Okay.
That kind of, it's a very heavy workload expected. The commitment and work ethic is probably a lot harder than you might expect. Okay. And in some ways, because they can often be on a knife edge financially, potentially, or there's big demands from investors for returns, you are going to be worked very, very hard.
Yes.
It'll be play hard as well. And you will have less of this kind of security, perhaps, than you would in a traditional banking environment. I wouldn't say it's kind of cutthroat, but it can be quite kind of quite hard work, and I think in some ways mirrors that kind of the investment banking ethic, where you're expected to be in early, you work very, 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 very hard. The rewards are higher, clearly.
Yeah,
it's always that risk reward conundrum. Yeah. You want the rewards. There is always going to be an element of risk in, whether that's a risk to your social life, to whether it's a risk to kind of family life. And part of the reason I stayed in the corporate bank was I didn't want to go into that investment banking mentality. Yeah, because the investment banking, you give your life up to that, but the rewards are incredibly high.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for our students to know. So thank you for bringing that up, because it is kind of a trade-off, as you kind of say. Like, people need to know what they're getting involved in before they say, yes, I definitely want to go down an investment bank route or a fintech route. But then you're working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're thinking, not for me. So that's really useful for us to know. And given your knowledge of traditional banking and future potential, would there be any area that you might direct our students to investigate a little further for themselves, for career-wise? Is there any kind of where you'd point us towards and say, have a look at that maybe?
There's a few areas I would say. There isn't really what I call traditional banking anymore, because I think banking has become a lot more specialised. The roles and skills are very different to what they were when I joined the bank.
Yeah.
A lot will depend what you're trying to get out of your career. If you're a people person, then relationship banking, whether that's kind of corporate investment banking or kind of personal banking. If you're analytic, there are kind of roles that fit almost every personality type.
Nice.
And I think the areas that are interesting, I guess, in terms of where banking is going and development is going, a lot around technology, open banking type roles, development of APIs, development of kind of how do banks future-proof themselves. I mean, we had an innovation team in Barclays, and we created a role for a guy whose title was innovation director. So
Okay.
literally looking at what could we do to make our products and services more relevant to the future.
Excellent.
So it's not like saying you're going to be a cashier or you're going to, those kind of roles don't exist in the kind of corporate bank.
Yeah.
So there are so many areas you can look at. A lot of work around artificial intelligence, particularly in the fraud and kind of compliance and regulatory areas. And that is a massive growth area for all banks because none of them want to slip up with the regulators. We've just seen all the kind of FinCEN papers released recently, so they're all yet again scrabbling, no doubt. I can remember every time one of these things go up, the panic those kind of things set off. So there's always reviews for that. Make future-proofing yourself for new money laundering directives and all of that stuff where there's been a huge growth in demand for skilled people. But there's still the need for good people managing clients. Because at the end of the day, a bank isn't a bank without having people that can manage the relationship with their clients, and even more so now because there's so much more competition. Absolutely. So the skill is in managing the client. People don't necessarily buy the brand. Yeah. Every bank can pretty much deliver everything. These commodity-based services. And I think the really successful teams, the really successful banks have excellent people facing clients. Yeah. They can then tailor and customize the products for the needs of the client.
Excellent. I think that's really good advice. I think it's because I think that often gets missed and people think of I guess, for lack of better phrasing, the hard skills. Well, a lot of those soft skills are what's still needed to get people in the door, to get people banking with you. You need those clients.
I tell you what, I think if we were ever interviewing for any roles, the top 4 or 5 skills and competencies that we were always looking for as a team were soft skills. Yeah. Technical skills, I can teach you a skill because they're pretty much standardized stuff. I can't teach you a competency. I cannot teach something that's innate to you as a person around how you interact with people. You can enhance it, but you can't teach that stuff. I think if somebody's a people person or a leader or has the communication skills, you can work on it, but I think they are those inherent factors of the things that all interviewers and hirers are looking for. So pretty much every bank I know and every firm I know works around a series of competencies. So each job role has a set of prescribed competencies that they're looking for. There will be some skills because there may be a very specific technical aspect requirement to a job, but more often than not, it's the soft skills that are foremost in a hiring manager's mind when they're looking to take people on.
Excellent. And for our MBAs on the call and for our wider CAS community, that's why we spend so much time doing soft skill training, why we spend so much time on Career Thursdays for our full-time MBAs and for our wider community, putting on workshops so that you have those soft skills that when you meet a Lloyds, you meet a Bank of Scotland, you meet a Barclays, you can come across quite well. So thanks a lot, Martin. Before we move on to fully into the fintech area of your career, how has the explosion of fintech affected banking? So, I'm thinking about here the Starling banks that have come on board, the Revolut, the Monzos. Has that really shaken up what would be maybe seen as traditional banking, or has it being more of a kind of side thing that's kind of gone on over there, and banking's plowed ahead as usual?
No, I think, look, if you went back 10, 12 years ago, it probably wasn't as well kind of recognised internally within banks.
Yeah.
There are a few of the kind of startup players that were around back then, but in the last few years, it has really highlighted the needs in banks to change their approach, whether that's to adopt some of the approaches that the fintechs take on. You've seen some of the high street banks building their own challenger banks internally.
Yes.
You've seen kind of banks acquiring fintechs, as Santander have done with Ebury and people like that. I think there's a move from the fintechs more towards the traditional banking as well. So I think the alignment's come a lot closer. Banks are a lot more aware, and they can pick and choose the best of the fintech. And I think that's one of the beauties of a big traditional organisation that's been around forever.
Yeah.
They might be slow to move, but they often have significant financial resources, and they can put those resources to do something really well if they chose to do it, or they could choose to acquire those skills or that business over time. So I kind of sit with a foot in both camps. I see the best in both worlds. There are undoubted advantages in some of the nimbleness and the kind of quick thinking that you see in the fintech market, but they also lack some of the kind of basic skill sets quite often around looking at things legally, compliance-wise, and with the benefit of grey hair around the experience, and then quite often make mistakes, some of which could be pretty fundamental if they got it really, really wrong.
Yeah, great advice. And as you kind of said there, you've got a foot in both camps now.
Yeah.
So what motivated you to kind of get that foot into fintech and become the head of fintech at Barclays?
Again, it was another one of those things I kind of fell into.
Okay.
I got offered the job at Barclays 13 years ago now, just before the kind of financial crash, the major financial crash. And I'd been looking around for a role. Bank of Scotland was clearly about to implode, so I thought I needed to get out.
Yeah.
It was pretty obvious what was going on there, and the role I was hired into wasn't called fintech. It was non-bank financial institutions dealing with brokers, and brokers meant everything from stock brokers, insurance brokers, and foreign exchange brokers. And in amongst the portfolio of clients that I've been looking after were three little businesses, one called HIFX, one called Moneycore, and another one called Eurochange. And they were all what I call very traditional FX payment brokers and bureau de change type businesses, travel money, international money transfers, and kind of that stuff. And it was the start of people had been emigrating or buying second homes to France, Spain. A lot of businesses were importing, exporting, so they serviced that market. And it was kind of, nobody else in the team wanted to look after them because there were all of the aggravation that was around because of the money laundering and compliance and the enhanced due diligence and the risk that was perceived. Oh, this is really interesting stuff. So again, I kind of fell into it, got to know the clients really well, got to enjoy, and you could see the potential of what they were doing. And the word started to get out, and I started to pick up a lot of business in that space. And from having a couple of clients, back in those days, it was very small revenue numbers. We built a team out of 150 corporate clients and all of the global big high household names, so the PayPals, the MasterCards, the Visas, and everybody else. And it was it kind of just grew and grew and kept growing. So it went from a team of me managing 3 clients to a team of 15 across the globe, managing 150 clients, making a huge amount of money for the bank.
Wow. And they're massive brands that you're talking about that ended up joining up with you as well. That's amazing. You say you fell into it. I think you're being too humble. I think you saw an opportunity and you seized it.
I think it was a little bit of both. There was something there. There were some big fights along the way.
Yeah.
Some real challenges. When HSBC got fined in 2008 for their money laundering failings, a lot of it was to do with the caixas in Mexico and other money transfer businesses. Yeah. There were serious considerations around pulling out the market. Lloyds pulled out the market at the time. HSBC had pulled out of the market. RBS took a massive step backwards as well. Yeah. So we did have some soul searching and a lot of fights internally around, do we continue? And we ended up shrinking at one stage and reducing the number of small clients and focusing on the very large names. A, because the revenue was higher, but the compliance and controls were done significantly better. So the risk reward was balanced. So even though you were taking a higher risk because of the risk of money laundering and compliance failings, there was the return in terms of the money that you can make from the client to justify having a relationship managing 10 clients, where a traditional team would have a relationship manager managing 20 clients.
Okay. I think that's a great story and lesson for our MBAs, our community. Resilience. You know, there was a lot of challenges there. You say a lot of fights as well, but you managed to be resilient. Maybe had to shrink for a little while, but then you grew back up again because people were seeing the rewards for the risk.
Yeah. There was also always a lot of change in senior management in banks.
Okay.
It's like they're like football managers. They seem to last 2 or 3 years at a time and then move on to the next thing. Found out. Excuse me, just a drink. So,
thought that was a bottle of wine for a minute.
The chili bottle. So yeah, and you often have to re-explain quite often.
Okay. Why
do we do this? How do we do it? Why? What controls and measures do you have in place? What's the why should we do this when there's a choice of doing something else somewhere else in the business? Because you're always fighting for capital. You're always fighting for investment, even within a small firm. Yeah. In a bank is no different. They're looking for a return on equity. So if you're going to deploy that equity, you've got choices about where you make it. Do you put it in the investment bank because it's making returns of this, or do you put it into a retail bank because it's less risky? So you're constantly having to re-justify your existence, and it's not just about necessarily just about the financial aspects. It's the reputational risk, it's the regulatory risk, and a lot of other things. So having answers to all of those things constantly. Yeah. I lost count of the number of presentations I did internally to senior management about why my team existed. That's particularly before the fintech boom really started. Why are we banking our competitors? Was the first question always got asked.
Absolutely crazy, considering how big fintech is now. Yeah. You wouldn't think those questions existed, but obviously you had to go through that phase first before you get those rewards. The big.
Yeah. And the question changed later is, how can we bank more of them, and how do we get more like them? Yeah. So, if that's a measure of success, that was quite good.
Excellent. I'd like to talk a little bit about what if I join fintech. So I'm a young graduate. I'm coming through, and maybe I'm working for you at Barclays, for example. What can I expect my day-to-day to be like? What? That's probably a big question, but yeah. Any kind of advice? What I could expect, maybe?
Yeah, I think you'd be very surprised. It is a bit of a cliche. No 2 days were ever the same.
Okay.
You've got a variety of challenges in terms of internal stuff. You have the client asks were sometimes really strange. Okay. So you're a problem solver a lot of the time. Or you'll be dealing with a regulator one day, dealing with a kind of internal compliance team the next day, dealing with the investment bank who wants to take a strategic investment in one of your clients the following day. All of I think the way, certainly in my team, as we were kind of relationship banking, we were the glue that held that all together and joined the dots, the conductor at the heart of the symphony, all of those kind of things, conducting and directing and managing to make sure the client got the best possible experience of working with a bank. A lot of it was problem solving, a lot of it's communication. You get a lot of support from typically from other team members who've been there, seen it, done it. You could be doing a lending proposition one minute and sorting out a problem somebody's had with an international payment that has gone missing the next. Connecting somebody to SWIFT, connecting them to faster payment scheme as a direct participant. It is so incredibly varied. You could be working in another part of the bank that's just dealing with foreign exchange buying and selling all day long. So you could have a specialist role, which is very narrow in terms of the duties and responsibilities, to something like mine, which was incredibly varied.
Excellent. I think a lot of our MBAs, especially speaking from previous cohorts and the conversations I've had with our new cohort, they'd enjoy that. They'd enjoy that varied day, that no day is the same. That would be energizing to a lot of people.
Yeah, it is.
And what roles would you direct an MBA to in a fintech? Is there any particular roles or functions that you'd say, okay, you've done an MBA, maybe you'd want to look over this side?
There are so many different roles, David. If I'm really honest, you could do pretty much anything.
That's good. Yeah. Okay.
If you've got a particular desire to get into the kind of financial side, you've got treasury, all of the kind of the finance departments. You've got people who may be more kind of mathematical and then get into the quant side in the investment bank. You want to do mergers and acquisitions. There's so many different, that you've got the compliance type roles and functions, the relationship management functions. It's so varied. I think a lot will depend on the type of person you are and the type of career that you want.
That's good advice, because it basically, it sounds like there's so much variety there that maybe the first step for our community, our students, is to think about yourself and what kind of person you are. If you're maybe the outgoing person, maybe a relationship management role. If you're more into the figures, into the details, and analytical roles. So know yourself first before you take that step outside. Would that be fair?
Most banks will have a careers website, and often it'll have, probably not so much these days given where we are at, but I know Barclays, we had the intern and kind of summer intern and grad processes, which gave people the opportunity, if they had an interest in a particular area, to apply for an internship in a particular part of the bank. So if you could go in and then experience it, or if you've got a friend, family member or colleague or somebody you know, reach out to them through LinkedIn, get yourself on an intern program and see it. I mean, a few weeks in the summer as you partway through your course or through your studies, definitely worth doing.
Absolutely. And to our community as well, reach out to people within the CAS community. You have a whole network there of people in fintechs, in banking. Reach out to them so you can discover what it's really like.
Yeah, definitely.
Would you have any advice for someone who's maybe thinking, okay, I've liked what Martin said so far about fintech, the variety, the difference. Would you have any advice to them whether they should maybe look at a larger organization, someone with a lot of history, a Santander, a Barclays, or whether they should move into one of those new companies coming up, like a Monzo or Revolut? Even though they've been around a few years, I'm going to class them as new in the financial services area.
Fintech's only been around for about 200, 300 years. I think pretty much my previous answer applies. I think a lot will depend on you as an individual, what roles you want, what kind of culture you want. But I think the cultures are slowly becoming very similar. Yeah, you'll get more variety in a larger organization because your role, you'll probably have a very specific role.
Yeah.
In a smaller challenger organization, you will probably have a broader role because they've got because there are less people and they need to spread those kind of skills around. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think it's down to you as an individual.
Personal preference.
The type of business you want to work for. There are pluses and minuses. Like I said, small, fast, nimble, exciting. The hours might be tough, challenging because the reward might be some distance off. And quite often the comp may be equity based as well. So you're not necessarily going to get big bucks working for a startup. But the upside is potentially higher. Working in a bank, you're going to be it is going to be more conservative. It is going to be a little bit more structured. And if you don't like structure and you want the flexibility, definitely go the fintech route. But if you kind of want the depth of history, experience, support, knowledge, and kind of environment that is like that, then the banks are probably more your thing.
Excellent, thank you. Before I move on to your career tips, because definitely want to get into your career tips, final question on fintechs. We're obviously in a new economic situation. Do you see that change in the way fintechs operate? So, for a few years, there was a lot of fintechs who were basically expanding, scaling rapidly, weren't really thinking about profitability, were more thinking about revenues and acquiring customers. Do you think our current economic situation will maybe change that? I know Monzo's been in the news recently. Do you have an opinion on how that might change or might not change in the coming months?
In some ways, I think what we're going through now has actually benefited the fintech world in a lot of respect, particularly the ones that have got a good client model.
Yes.
When I came to see you guys, did a little chat at CAS a few months ago, you've still got to have the idea and proposition that actually is there for the client. We saw so many businesses with good ideas, but there wasn't really something there in terms of a commercial operating model. It's still got to make money. I think those firms that have done that and are well funded are absolutely thriving at the moment, and I think they will continue to do so. All firms that are invested in that way, where you've got a lot of kind of invested money, they will eventually have to move to profitability, or they will have to be sold to the next round of investors. So how sustainable is that? Well, we've been going for quite a few years through this cycle. Most of the kind of early stage unicorns are now operating profitably, or certainly profitably in their early markets. So TransferWise in the UK would be significantly profitable, but in its kind of overseas markets, its newer markets, it may not necessarily be profitable. So, and when that gets to the stage where the whole business is profitable, who knows? They're all still going to be that, and that's a traditional private equity model, regardless of whether it's fintech or otherwise. The investors ultimately want a return on their investment, and whether that's from profits or selling their investment, that's the two ways they get their kind of returns. So, profitability has to come at some point. But I think while we're in the environment we're in at the moment, it does favour the fintechs, I would say.
Excellent, thank you. I want to dive into your career tips. So you've been a hiring manager previously. What would be some of the common mistakes people make when they're going through that recruitment process? Is there any ones that kind of come up again and again, and you touching your head and going, please don't do that?
I'd probably prefer to turn it on its head and say kind of what's a good approach, and it will throw out the kind of mistakes as we go. I think the first kind of mistake and the first good practice tip really is have a good CV. Use a professional to help you pull it together if you can. Make sure it's well structured, not too wordy, plenty of white space, and make it really clear and concise about who you are, what your skills are, what is you. You have a really good, strong opening. Detail's probably not all that important, particularly if you're going into what you did 10 years ago. The most recent stuff has to be the most relevant and most well thought through. And it should be tailored to the role that you're applying for. Don't send the same CV out to every firm that you're applying to, because they will all be looking for a different set of competencies and different set of skills. And that is typically your first interaction with the hirer. Most hirers will probably be seeing 20 to 30 CVs minimum per role that's being applied for. How do you stand out? And I'll tell you, you scan read most CVs the first time, and some will stick in mind, and they'll be the ones that kind of, and the professional, well prepared CV is an absolute must. When you're preparing for the kind of hiring process, get in touch with the hiring manager, get in touch with somebody on their team, get to know what that firm is like, reach out through your network and connections. Do you know somebody who works there? Can they introduce you? We used to hire a lot internally within Barclays, and I was staggered by the number of people who could see on the application form who the hiring manager is. They could see it was a kind of a reasonably specialist job. So few people reached out. Can we just go and have a coffee chat? Tell me about the job. I'll more than happily spend 20, 30 minutes doing that, because it helps me then, if they do apply, I've got a little bit of a feel for them as well. Or I would ask one of my team members to go out there, and I used to positively encourage it. And in the end, if somebody hadn't made contact with us for a coffee chat, their CV would be rejected.
But really important.
That was on internal hires. Clearly, maybe a little bit more challenging if you're an external hire. But there's always going to be somebody in your LinkedIn network, in your cohort that knows somebody. I had an old colleague of mine who used to work for on my cash management team back in 2012, 2013, reached out to me last night and said, do you know Richard Davis at Revolut? He obviously knew I was, and this guy is now working for HSBC in New York. So I have met Richard a couple of times, but I do know this guy. Did your paths cross when you worked at Barclays together? No. Look, I'll introduce you. So, and this was so he could phone up this guy who just joined and said, give me a bit of a feel what it's like to work in Revolut. Give me some pointers, and do you know the hiring manager? Is there something about this role? So those kind of connections, if you do that, and if you do that well, you're probably halfway there. If you've made a good impression, making sure you've got really, really good examples for the interview. But if you're going through a competency-based interview, which 99% of firms hire on the basis of competencies, have an example that fits. And it might fit more than one competency. And make sure you know the story inside out. Use I, not we, all the kind of the traditional expectation. But make sure you know that story and I wouldn't change it on the fly, but you evolve it to suit. If it sounds like a script, it's not going to come across. So if you can naturally...
Must be natural.
Have some good questions about when you get the chance at the end of the interview, ask good questions. Why do you want a job? And if you're enthusiastic and passionate about why you're there, and have asked really good questions of the hirer, even if they're tough ones, don't be afraid to ask a tough one.
Yeah.
That again I would say is a really good kind of tip. Obvious ones: turn up on time, all the kind of stuff. I remember back in the day we used to be assessed on our appearance. That's probably not quite so important, but be appropriate. If you're turning up to a traditional bank, they would expect you to be in a suit. If you're going in for a kind of fintech type interview, the waistcoat and the fintech look might be more appropriate. I don't know whether I'd go to see TransferWise in a t-shirt if I was going for a hire, maybe. But if you hadn't done your research and spoke to somebody and spoke to the hiring manager, they're the kind of things that you can find out.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's really great advice. So I'm going to signpost a few bits of that for our community. So first off, make sure you have a CV that is relevant to the role and is tailored to the role. And for anyone in our cohort and anyone at our business school, you have career advisors who will help you do that as well as part of your course. So please make use of them. They're great at doing it. They do it all year round. So please make use of that. Also, your interviews as well, have those stories ready to display your competencies. Again, our career advisors will actually take you through mock interviews so you can actually try them out in a real environment. I think that's incredibly important. What else did we have there? We also had, reach out. You're networking. One of the most important things, reach out to your network and know about the actual job, about the role, about the company. Make sure you do your research in advance. Again, because you're a member of our business school, you can reach out to people who are alumni. They're more than willing to help. They're very happy to help people, particularly people who've been in their situation previously, to talk to you. So make use of that. Final question before I move over to our MBA questions. For someone, what advice would you give someone who's looking to build a career in the financial services? Is there any final bits of wisdom you could maybe give our cohort?
Be passionate. If you really want to build a career in any business, I think be passionate. Do something you enjoy. You're going to spend the next 30, 40 years working. It's much easier to get up in the morning if you enjoy what you do. So find the right job, find the right kind of thing that is really going to suit you as an individual. And I think, have fun, because you spend a lot of time working. I had a great time at Barclays. Fantastic team, and there weren't many mornings where I got up and thought I wasn't looking forward to going into work. And even in some really tough times, because some of the tough times are the ones that actually are the most rewarding and most kind of are the ones that expand you as an individual more than anything.
Excellent. Yes, absolutely. And particularly for our MBAs, use this year to explore so that you make sure you find that passionate role, that passionate company for you. Across to our students for some questions. We've got some questions coming in. Premal, I'm going to turn on your mic if you wouldn't mind asking your question, please. There you go. So if you turn on your mic, we can have a question.
Hi, thank you, David.
Thank you.
So my question is that what skills does a fintech company look for an MBA candidate? And also, I've been going through a lot of JDs which say that an MBA must have some prior, not an MBA, but a candidate must have some prior experience, some prior relevant experience to that role. So what if a person doesn't have that prior, relevant experience? What can he or she do? Thank you.
Okay, so if I understand the question, so it's the skills and experience. I know when I was hiring, I wouldn't necessarily be looking for prior experience. I think a lot will depend on the firm. I took a guy who was an ex-army helicopter pilot and turned him into a relationship banker. We've had all kinds of. I think a really good hiring firm will be looking for the kind of the competencies, as I said, rather than necessarily the having had formal experience in a role. If you haven't, I guess you could look at doing internships and working in other areas that are relevant. I think look for examples of things in your past that are kind of similar to what they're saying, whilst it might not be immediately, I've worked for 10 years or 5 years in a Revolut, but I have done X, Y, Z somewhere else, or the skills that I've built up as part of my MBA are equally as relevant. Again, it's back to tailoring your actual experiences and skills to the role, rather than necessarily having a tick box. I've got X, Y, Z experiences. A lot of firms, I'm not seeing the kind of firms that I know hiring looking at things in that kind of way.
Great. Thanks a lot. That's great advice. Fred, I'm going to turn on your mic. It'd be great to ask your question. Good question.
Hiya. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
I think you kind of answered the first question, so I had two questions actually. But we've been speaking quite a bit with different bankers in the industry and different sectors, and I get the sense, actually not from you, but from them, that they feel like they enjoy their jobs, but they don't feel like there's much difference that they make in sort of the wider sense, and they haven't found much kind of deeper meaning behind their work. I just wanted to know at what point you feel in your career you made the most difference to those around you, and the
Wow,
value.
that's a great question. I think a lot does depend on roles. There have been times, certainly looking back, where you some of the stuff that you do was pretty mundane. You, particularly if you're in a kind of part of the bank that is relatively limited, and I would have to say the kind of the fintech period, the last 10, 12 years, in terms of moving forward the bank's attitude to the sector, the impact the sector has had on society in general, not just from the kind of innovation front, but being able to support the movement of remittances globally has been absolutely essential. And there was an argument internally about 7 or 8 years ago where the consideration was given to shutting down all cash remittance firms. It's the most high-risk part of moving money any bank does. Every other bank in the UK had pulled out totally of providing service to these firms. So I really did dig my heels in on this one. And the fact that we stuck by it when we probably moved 80 to 90% of the remittances that left the UK in 2018, 2019. So that's probably the bit I think that's made the most difference.
Great.
Excellent.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. We're running short on time, but I'd love to get just 2 more questions in. So Jerry, I'm going to turn on your mic. Please ask your question. Thanks a lot.
Hi, Martin. I found a lot of common between us, especially the way that you move and switch from Lloyds Bank to Scotland. And actually, I have 10 years of banking experience back in Hong Kong in both retail and commercial areas. In Hong Kong, commercial banking is more rely on asset-based model, no matter if it's a trade finance or a fixed asset facility. And heard that in Europe, commercial bank is more rely on transactional model. Can you share or elaborate a bit more about how commercial bank work in UK?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jerry. And I think there has been a transition away from the focus. A lot will depend on the sector. My sector, and certainly the non-bank financial institutions and the financial institution sector, is known as transaction banking, and the focus is around dealing with payments, dealing with deposits, and dealing with money. The traditional kind of banker as a lender model is changing and has changed probably since 2009, 2010, the financial crisis. Because of the cost of capital, banks make very little money from lending money these days, and the kind of return on equity, return on investment for a lending product is insignificant when you compare it to the returns you make from doing a foreign exchange transaction or doing a payment transaction. So now you'll find that most banks won't lend money unless they've got other products and services. So in the past, you would do a standalone loan to help somebody acquire a piece of machinery, for example. Now, you wouldn't do that. You would never do that unless you were doing the businesses, import, export, foreign exchange, etc., etc. So there's been a shift away from that debt-based banking to more transaction-based banking, partly because of regulation and partly because it just broadens the revenue stream for the bank.
Thank you. So long fund income is more emphasized also in Europe, right?
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Final question for today. Over to you, Peter.
Yes. Thank you, Martin, for your for the insight today. I've actually spent some time in various different sizes of companies, mainly worked in small businesses, including fintech so far in my career. And I found that from my experience anyway, that small companies will, I guess when I'm talking about small, I'm talking less than 100 employees, they tend to hire people and recognize sort of skills and abilities, and will often allow transferal of those skills outside of maybe the specific role they've been hired into. My experience within larger organizations, and bearing in mind I haven't worked for a Barclays, is that they tend to hire someone with a specific role in mind, often requesting formal knowledge in that area, and often won't necessarily invest in transferring maybe those skills or knowledge into different areas within the business. I guess two questions feeding from that. Is that experience uncommon? I worked at a company, I'm not sure, you may know of them, called Go Cardless, which is a payments processor. And if you're looking on a scale of larger corporates moving towards a Barclays, for example, do they sort of invest more in that sort of transferal of knowledge and development within or in between roles?
Look, I think I'd like to say it was more widespread than it is. I think there are still parts of some large organisations that are still a little bit kind of focused on absolutely having the skills handed to them on a plate. I think sometimes in the kind of the fintech world, they haven't necessarily always got the time to teach the skills and transfer the skills. I know Go Cardless extremely well. They're an old client and a really good firm. So I don't know about the kind of hiring, kind of firing process, but I've seen a little bit of both in both sides of the business. A lot depends on the hiring managers and the teams that they're hiring for. Sometimes there are roles that are very, very skill dependent, so you've got to show that you've got the specific experience. And I think from a fintech, particularly if you're early stage or mid stage, you haven't got the time to sit there and pass the knowledge on. You've been hired in for a very specific reason, therefore you sometimes need very specific skills and are expected to hit the ground running.
Yeah, that's definitely the sort of the impression I had, and I think the sort of I've seen within a number of businesses anyway, I think especially the less profitable or not profitable businesses, sort of the much more sort of cutthroat nature, as you mentioned, of hiring.
Yeah, I think as they mature and grow, they are definitely shifting their approach and a balance of skills. You look at the kind of even the age demographic is changing. So the firms that you would see, maybe when I would walk into some of them 4 or 5 years ago, everybody's sub 30 or maybe even under 25. Now I think there's a massive increase in diversity, both in age, sex, gender, and ethnicity, which I think is absolutely essential. Any firm should be pushing for that mix in diversity, because their clients are diverse. And if you have everybody in the firms under 25, that's not necessarily a good recipe for a successful business long term. And I think a lot of firms are recognising that need for a huge mix-up in terms of their kind of diversity across the board.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. Thank you, Martin. It's been a pleasure to have you here, sharing your knowledge with our community. Big thank you to our students for the great questions and for taking part today. That wraps us up for today's episode of Curious Careers. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, David.